What if the universe granted you the impossible perspective of witnessing your own funeral? Throughout the vast tapestry of human history, there exists a remarkable phenomenon where the boundary between life and death momentarily blurs, creating a cosmic anomaly in our otherwise predictable existence. Imagine the scene. You're sitting in a dimly lit room, newspaper in hand, when something extraordinary catches your eye. There, printed in stark black and white, is your own obituary. Not a future prediction, not a drafting error, but a fully published declaration of your demise, complete with the somber assessment of your life's accomplishments and failures laid bare for the world to scrutinize. In this moment, you've joined an exclusive club of individuals who've experienced death while still very much alive. What would you do with this impossible knowledge? How would it feel to read the universe's final verdict on your existence, while your heart still beats steadily in your chest? This seemingly fantastical scenario has occurred with surprising frequency throughout history, creating a peculiar club of individuals who have had the rare opportunity to witness how the world memorializes them. Some used this macabre gift to reinvent themselves, while others were simply victims of misidentification or journalistic incompetence. But perhaps the most fascinating question isn't how these errors occurred, but rather, what happens when a person can see beyond their own grave? First up, the merchant prince who faked his funeral. In the late 18th century, on the northeastern shores of America, there lived a man whose life defied all conventional wisdom about success. Timothy Dexter was born in 1747 to a modest family of farmers in Malden, Massachusetts. With minimal education and what many contemporaries described as a profound lack of intelligence, Dexter seemed destined for obscurity. Yet through a series of decisions so absurd they bordered on brilliant, he amassed a fortune that would be worth millions in today's currency. But it wasn't his unlikely financial success that earned him a place in our curious tale. It was his theatrical relationship with death itself. By 1806, Dexter had already established himself as one of early America's most eccentric figures. He'd written a nearly incomprehensible book titled A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, devoid of any punctuation, only to add a page of punctuation marks in the second edition for readers to pepper and salt it as they please. He'd erected statues of famous figures, including himself, on his property, with inscriptions proclaiming himself
the greatest philosopher in the Western world.
But Dexter's most audacious performance was yet to come. Curious about how the public would react to his passing, he meticulously staged his own funeral. He didn't merely spread rumours of his death, he orchestrated an elaborate ceremony with all the trappings of a genuine memorial. Mourners gathered, eulogies were prepared, and a coffin was displayed while Dexter himself watched the proceedings from a concealed vantage point. The reactions proved illuminating. While some attendees displayed genuine grief, Dexter was enraged to discover his wife was not among them. In fact, historical accounts suggest she was rather celebratory during what should have been a somber occasion. Upon witnessing this betrayal, Dexter emerged from hiding and chased his wife through their home with a cane, insisting she hadn't been grieving properly. This bizarre incident raises profound questions about human psychology. What deep insecurity compels someone to stage their own death? What truth was Dexter seeking in this macabre social experiment? And perhaps most disquieting, what would we learn if we could witness our own memorials? Next up, the Dynamite King's moment of reckoning. While Timothy Dexter's funeral charade was a deliberate piece of theatre, other notable figures have encountered their obituaries through genuine errors of journalism, none perhaps more famously, or consequentially, than Alfred Nobel, the Swedish chemist, engineer, and industrialist whose name is now synonymous with excellence. In 1888, Nobel's brother Ludwig died while visiting Cannes, France. A French newspaper, confusing the brothers, published Alfred's obituary instead, under the damning headline, "The Merchant of Death is Dead." The paper continued its assault on Nobel's legacy, declaring,
Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday.
The mistake created an extraordinary moment of existential clarity for Nobel. Healthy and very much alive at 55 years old, he was confronted with how history would remember him. Not as a brilliant inventor or industrialist, but as a merchant of death whose fortune came from weapons of destruction. The primary source of Nobel's wealth was indeed his invention of dynamite and other explosives, which, although created primarily for mining and construction, had obvious military applications. What followed represents one of history's most remarkable acts of legacy rehabilitation. Profoundly affected by this premature obituary, Nobel decided to rewrite his impact on civilization. When he died for real 8 years later in 1896, his last will and testament shocked the world. He had dedicated the vast majority of his fortune, the equivalent of over $200 million today, to establish prizes honoring those who conferred the greatest benefit to mankind in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. Thus, the Nobel Prizes were born from a mistaken obituary. A simple journalistic error transformed how we recognize human achievement, creating what has become the world's most prestigious intellectual honor. One wonders, without that fateful newspaper mistake, would we still have these prizes? Would Nobel have continued his life without this profound moment of self-reflection? The Twain mark of death.
The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated.
This iconic quote, or some variation of it, is often attributed to Mark Twain and relates to one of history's most famous premature obituary incidents. The full story behind this quip reveals much about both journalism and celebrity in the late 19th century. In 1897, while Twain, born Samuel Clemens, was on a speaking tour in London, his cousin became seriously ill back in America. Somehow, through a game of transatlantic telephone, this transformed into rumours of Twain himself being gravely ill, which further mutated into reports of his death. The New York Journal apparently went so far as to dispatch a reporter to investigate, prompting Twain's famous response. The exact wording of Twain's retort has been debated by historians. Some sources claim he wrote, "The report of my death was an exaggeration," while others cite, "The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." Regardless of the precise phrasing, the incident showcases Twain's characteristic wit in the face of absurdity. What makes this case particularly interesting is that it wasn't an isolated incident. Twain experienced another false death report in 1907. The confusion arose when a yacht he was believed to be travelling on encountered difficulties at sea. Informed about this second obituary mishap, Twain reportedly quipped,
"I'm a pretty sick man, but I'm not dead yet."
The Twain incidents highlight a recurring challenge in pre-modern journalism: verification. In an era before instantaneous global communication, news travelled slowly and was often distorted along the way. A whispered concern could become a grave illness, which could transform into death by the time it reached a newspaper editor's desk. Without easy means to check facts, newspapers sometimes published information that was, at best, speculative. Twain's experience with premature obituaries also speaks to the nature of celebrity. While most ordinary citizens wouldn't warrant national news coverage of their supposed demise, Twain's status as America's preeminent humorist and author made his mortality newsworthy. In this way, these false reports underscore his cultural significance. You know you've arrived when newspapers are eager to report your departure. The Pope who lived. The complications of verifying death took a particularly dramatic turn in Vatican City in 1989, creating what must surely be one of history's most awkward journalistic moments. On July 5th of that year, TASS, the official news agency of the Soviet Union, reported that Pope John Paul II had died. The announcement was swiftly picked up by media outlets worldwide, creating momentary global confusion. There was just one problem. The Pope was very much alive. In fact, he was giving an address in Austria at the precise moment the Soviet agency declared him deceased. What makes this era particularly fascinating is its political context. This occurred during the final years of the Cold War, when relations between the Soviet Union and the West, including the Catholic Church, remained tense despite ongoing reforms. Pope John Paul II, born in Poland as Karol Wojtyła, had been an influential figure in challenging Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, particularly in his native Poland. The Vatican's response to this false report was swift and tinged with the dry humour one might not expect from such an institution. A spokesman simply stated,
"The Pope is alive and well. It is TASS that is dead wrong."
This incident reveals how even in the relatively modern media landscape of the late 1980s, with its telexes and emerging satellite communications, significant errors could still occur. It also demonstrates how death announcements, particularly of major world figures, remain vulnerable to both honest mistakes and perhaps more calculated misinformation. The false report of the Pope's death serves as a reminder that obituaries are more than mere biographical summaries. They are powerful tools of historical narrative that can shape global politics and public perception. In this case, the error was quickly corrected, but it momentarily placed the Pope in that rare category of individuals who witnessed the world's reaction to their supposed passing. Marcus Garvey's fatal reading. Not all encounters with one's obituary end with the humour of Mark Twain or the philanthropic transformation of Alfred Nobel. For some, the psychological impact can be devastating, even fatal. Such was the tragic case of Marcus Garvey, the influential Pan-Africanist leader and founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. In 1940, Garvey suffered a stroke that left him significantly weakened, but recovering in London. While convalescing, he read a particularly harsh obituary of himself in the Chicago Defender, which had erroneously reported his death. The obituary was far from flattering, describing Garvey as broke, alone and unpopular, rather than celebrating his substantial achievements in organising one of the largest movements for black economic empowerment in history. It focused on his controversies and perceived failures. The psychological impact of reading such a negative assessment proved catastrophic. According to several historical accounts, Garvey suffered another stroke shortly after reading the obituary, and this second stroke proved fatal. He died on June 10, 1940, at the age of 52. Garvey's case illustrates the incredible power of public perception. While most people never know how history will judge them, Garvey had the unique misfortune of seeing a preview, and it was devastating. The cruel irony is that his legacy has been substantially rehabilitated in the decades since his death. Today, he is widely recognised as a pioneering civil rights leader whose work influenced generations of activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. This tragic episode raises profound questions about the responsibility of journalism and historical assessment. How might Garvey's final days have differed if the Premature obituary had acknowledged his considerable accomplishments rather than emphasising his controversies? Can the shock of confronting one's public legacy actually hasten death? The man who died twice on Apple's watch. The peculiar phenomenon of premature obituaries isn't confined to history's pages. In modern times, technological systems have created entirely new ways for such errors to occur. In 2008, Bloomberg Financial News Service accidentally published a 17-page obituary for Apple co-founder Steve Jobs, who was very much alive, though dealing with health issues. The pre-written obituary, intended to be updated and published only upon Jobs' actual death, was accidentally released to the Bloomberg terminal subscribers before being hastily retracted. What makes this incident particularly interesting is that it exposed a common journalistic practice, preparing obituaries for notable figures well in advance. Major news organizations maintain extensive files of pre-written obituaries for celebrities, politicians, and business leaders, ready to be updated and published at a moment's notice when death actually occurs. This practice ensures comprehensive coverage can be published quickly, but it also creates the risk of premature publication. Jobs, known for his intensely private nature regarding personal matters, never publicly commented on seeing his own obituary. However, at a public event shortly afterward, he appeared on stage with a slide displaying Mark Twain's famous quote about exaggerated reports of death, suggesting he maintained his characteristic dark humour about the situation. Ironically, when Jobs did pass away in 2011, after a long battle with pancreatic cancer, many outlets likely used updated versions of the very same obituaries that had been accidentally published years earlier. In this way, Jobs experienced a rare circumstance of having his life's achievements summarised twice, once while alive and once posthumously. The Jobs incident demonstrates how, even in our era of instant communication and fact-checking, the fundamental human error of publishing an obituary too soon persists. If anything, digital publishing platforms have made such mistakes potentially more common, as the click of a single button can instantly broadcast information worldwide. Ernest Hemingway's African misadventure. Few literary figures cultivated a public persona of adventure and danger as thoroughly as Ernest Hemingway. His larger-than-life exploits as a big-game hunter, deep-sea fisherman, war correspondent and boxer became almost as famous as his spare, influential prose. It seems fitting, then, that Hemingway would experience not just a premature obituary, but one resulting from a dramatic plane crash in the African wilderness. In January 1954, Hemingway and his fourth wife Mary were on a sightseeing flight over the Belgian Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, when their chartered plane struck an abandoned utility pole and crash-landed in heavy brush. Though injured, they survived and managed to reach shore by using the plane's emergency door as a raft. The following day, attempting to reach medical assistance, they boarded another small plane that also crashed on takeoff, catching fire. Hemingway reportedly used his head as a battering ram against the plane's door to escape the burning wreckage, suffering burns and another concussion. Despite these harrowing experiences, both Ernest and Mary survived. News of the crashes spread quickly, but with communications from remote African locations being unreliable, many newspapers reported that Hemingway had perished. The obituaries were extensive, reviewing his literary achievements, his adventurous life, and his influence on American letters. Hemingway, recovering in Nairobi, had the surreal experience of reading numerous accounts of his own demise. In characteristic fashion, Hemingway seemed to relish the drama of the situation. He reportedly enjoyed the obituaries, particularly those that praised his work, keeping newspaper clippings as souvenirs. According to some accounts, he even held court in his hospital room, regaling visitors with embellished tales of the crashes, while surrounded by the very newspapers declaring him dead. The incident added yet another chapter to Hemingway's mythology of survival and adventure. However, it also occurred at a pivotal point in his life. The extensive injuries he suffered during these crashes, particularly the head traumas, are believed by many biographers to have contributed to his physical and mental decline in subsequent years. The man who survived to read his obituaries would, within 7 years, take his own life at his home in Idaho. The computer that killed hundreds. As we've seen, human error has traditionally been the culprit behind premature obituaries, but in the digital age, automated systems have created entirely new ways for the living to be declared dead. Perhaps no case better illustrates this than a 2009 incident involving Sweden's tax agency database. In February of that year, the Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter reported a bizarre technological mishap. The Swedish tax agency's national registration computer system had accidentally declared approximately 300 living Swedes deceased. These digital deaths had very real consequences. The affected individuals suddenly found themselves locked out of their bank accounts, had their credit cards cancelled, and lost access to various government services, all systems that automatically responded to the death notifications. One victim, a 58-year-old man named Jan Eriksson, described the Kafkaesque experience of trying to prove he wasn't dead.
The bank said I was deceased. They said, "You're not in our computers anymore." Trying to get a new bank card or withdraw money was impossible. I had to show them my driver's license to prove I was alive.
The tax agency scrambled to correct the error, sending out resurrection letters, a term that must surely rank among the most unusual in bureaucratic history, to those affected, officially confirming they were, in fact, still alive. However, the process of being digitally reborn proved time-consuming, with some victims spending weeks in a bizarre bureaucratic limbo, legally dead despite their continuing biological functions. This modern case is particularly intriguing because it represents an evolution in the nature of erroneous death reports. Throughout most of history, being declared dead prematurely was primarily a social phenomenon with limited practical consequences beyond potential emotional distress. In our interconnected digital society, however, being listed as deceased in a government database can effectively erase a person's ability to function in society, regardless of their actual vital signs. The Swedish computer error demonstrates how, in many ways, our digital identities have become as important as our physical existence. When systems determine you're dead, proving otherwise requires navigating a labyrinthine bureaucracy never designed to handle the living dead. Noela Rukundo, death by hitman. While most cases of premature obituaries involve misidentification or clerical errors, some are the result of more sinister circumstances. Few stories illustrate this more dramatically than that of Noela Rukundo, whose death was no accident but rather a carefully orchestrated murder plot, commissioned by her husband. In January 2015, Rukundo travelled from her home in Melbourne, Australia, to her native Burundi to attend her stepmother's funeral. While there, she was kidnapped by a group of men hired by her husband, Balenga Kalala, to kill her. Remarkably, the would-be hitmen ultimately released her after deciding they couldn't go through with killing a woman. They even provided evidence of her husband's involvement, including phone recordings of him discussing the hit. Rather than immediately alerting authorities, Rukundo devised an extraordinary plan. She remained dead for several days, allowing her husband to proceed with funeral arrangements back in Australia. Then, on the day of her memorial service, as mourners were leaving her home, Rukundo appeared in person to confront her husband.
Surprise, I'm still alive.
She reportedly told the shocked Kalala, who initially believed he was seeing a ghost. When he realised his wife was indeed alive and aware of his plot against her, he reportedly touched her shoulder and said,
"Is it my eyes? Is it a ghost?"
Surprise, I'm still alive.
She repeated.
You're a fool.
The confrontation led to Kalala's confession, an eventual 9-year prison sentence for incitement to murder. Rukundo's extraordinary story received international attention, not only for its dramatic elements, but also for the remarkable composure and calculated justice of her response. Unlike most individuals who discover erroneous reports of their death, Rukundo had the unique experience of attending her own funeral service with full knowledge that it was occurring, and that the primary mourner was the very person who had attempted to end her life. Her case represents perhaps the most extreme example of using presumed death as a tool for revealing truth. Throughout history, the phenomenon of premature obituaries has created a unique club of individuals who glimpsed how the world would memorialize them after death. From Timothy Dexter's staged funeral to Alfred Nobel's legacy-altering revelation, these incidents reveal something profound about human psychology and our relationship with mortality. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these stories isn't the journalistic errors or technological glitches that caused them. It's what the affected individuals chose to do with this rare insight. Some, like Nobel, fundamentally altered their life's direction. Others, like Twain, responded with characteristic wit. And some, like Garvey, suffered devastating consequences from confronting their public legacy too soon. These cases prompt us to consider a disquieting question. If you could read your own obituary today, what would it say? More importantly, would you be satisfied with that final assessment? Or would you, like Nobel, be compelled to rewrite your impact on the world? In an age where our digital presence increasingly defines our existence, perhaps we're all unconsciously writing our obituaries in real time, crafting the narrative that will outlive us through our online actions and public personas. The difference is that most of us will never see the final draft, unless, like the extraordinary cases we've explored, we somehow find ourselves in that most unusual circumstance, attending our own funeral,